Madam Chair. This is Ray, and I thought I'd start out and just get us kind of the backgrounded and then bring us to where we are today. I think everybody has in their packet a spreadsheet that on the top says Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission Budget Projection Fund 1000 Fiscal Year 12. This is the spreadsheet with attachments that was sent to JLBC as a part of answering Speaker Tobin's request. And just to summarize first, the amount that we show at that time to be short would be $530,000 for this year. I've looked at that number several times, and it kind of goes up and down. I think I sent you a document last week where I thought that it probably would go up based upon the hours I thought were going to go into the submissions. This week I saw one of the legal bills. It was less than I anticipated. The bottom line is I think this $530,000 figure is probably the best estimate I can give you, because I'm really dealing with things that are unknown. If you look across the total columns, you'll see that it projects that we're going to spend $3,530,000 in fiscal year 12. Our appropriation is $3 million. By way of comparison, if you drop down to the next row, you see a cost of $3,338,000, and that is what the 2001-2002 Commission spent. And that's simply put there to give a reference in terms of 10 years ago, what was spent and how do we look. Of course, keep in mind that 10 years have passed by, and inflation in that period of time is pretty close to 25%. So it kind of shows that we're not way off of what happened 10 years ago. The second line, which shows the $600,000 amount in the very right column, is what we had requested in the supplemental request to the legislature and to the governor, planning out that we would have enough funds if the map were challenged in this fiscal year to make sure we could get it to approval, or to defend it if the Department of Justice were to come back and ask for additional information, or even if they said they rejected it, and then we would be in a position of having to develop an interim map, and then we'd be in a position of having to go back and develop another map, and all of that costs money. I basically have put down $200,000 for April, May, and June as potential expenses, and you can see that in the line total supplemental request. And if you looked at the line just above that, you can see that in April, May, and June of 2002, that commission spent $151,000, $300,000, and $310,000. And if you average those, it comes out right about to $200,000 a month. That's how I came about that figure. The rest of the bottom of the page just provides more information on the major expenditures that the last commission was involved in. Again, to give some comparison, but again, I would remind everyone that costs have gone up a lot in 10 years. The following pages really are expenditure information as of the date that this was sent to JLBC. You can look at more detail. It provides more detail by accounting category. The next to last page shows fiscal year 13. This is the budget amount that we worked with some time ago with the budget staff of the governor's office, and this is what's in the governor's recommended budget, and it's a fiscal year 13 appropriation of $1.7 million. Again, the primary purpose of having an appropriation in fiscal year 13 is to make sure that we can continue, if there's litigation, continue to defend the maps and make sure that there's maps for future elections. I think that is the gist of 2012, 2013. The other item in your packet I had done a couple weeks ago to try to estimate how we would look in March. And basically, at the time we put this together, and I don't think it's changed very much, we took how much money we knew we had left right now, subtracted all of the January expenses, and then you can see there's two columns of February, some that had been paid and some were in process. If you take a look at that, we have $623,000 left in allotment, $723,000 or $33,000 in appropriation. And again, as you recall, the Office of Budget and Strategic Planning is holding back $110,000 in allotment. In case we do not receive the supplemental, we would have enough money to pay staff to close up shop. The next, looking under the total allotment of $623,000, February costs are $487,000. That would leave us, that is really what our balance is at this particular point in time. Would be taking 487 from 623. If I remember right, without looking at it, it means about $172,000. If you add the projection of what we had for March from the JLDC report, you can see that by the end of March we would be short $134,000. And in essence, that tells me we're not going to make it through the month of March. And again, I caution, we're dealing with a lot of things that are very hard to estimate, but I think it's very clear that the funding that we currently have will not allow us to guarantee that we've met our constitutional responsibilities and have an adopted map that can be used in future elections of the state of Arizona. Subsequent to this information being developed, we also in your packet have a list of all the contacts we have made with legislative leadership and the staff. Since then, we have continued to have meetings explaining what our situation is. There have now been two bills introduced in the legislature, one in the House by Representative Kavanaugh, and he is requesting an appropriation of $1.1 million. We've been informed that we will be asked to testify next Wednesday, March 7th, on our request. A second bill has been submitted in the Senate. That bill does not have an amount of money, and basically also has in it that there be a request for 90 days after the funds are available, an audit of agency finances. This morning, in meeting with staff in the House, their legal counsel, Peter Gencalia, Michael Huckins, and let's see, Lorenzo Romero, we talked about the differences in bills. They were going to talk to Representative Kavanaugh to see if he would talk to Senator Shooter, and see if there's a way that the two bills might be made the same. One issue that both bills don't address is that our request anticipated or assumed that the funds available in 11 would be carried, or in 12 would be able to carry over to 13. They also, the staff, were going to talk to Representative Kavanaugh about that. Rather than go through all the people we've met with verbally, we'll update that with you. In the last 3 days, it looks like we've hit about 8 different staff members and Representative Kavanaugh to talk about and provide them information. I need to say that the staff, all the staff we've met with have been extremely cooperative, helpful, and offered suggestions as how we should proceed. And as you know, you have the most inexperienced lobbying team, so we take to heart anything they tell us, and they've been very gracious to help us understand the process. So today, I think that really covers the financial part. I'm certainly ready to answer questions. I think that it's clear to me, and that's why I'm bringing it to you, that by the 16th or so of this month, we'll be out of funds. Whether or not the legislature can act that quickly is an unknown. Whether or not the legislature will act positively is an unknown. Therefore, I thought it was appropriate to come forward and let you know what our finances are so we can decide next steps. And with that, Madam Chair, I'd be available for questions.
Excellent. Thanks, Ray. Any questions for Mr. Bladeen?
Madam Chair, this is Jose.
Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Bladeen, the commission 10 years ago, were they facing the same situation when they were, I think, running out of funds? If they did, what steps did they take?
Vice Chair, yes, the last commission started out with an appropriation of $6 million, and somewhere between 2003 and 2004, they had expended all of the funds they had, and they came forward and requested a supplemental appropriation. They also, at that time, filed a special action, and before the special action was adjudicated, the legislature provided the funds. They then had to come back one more time for a second appropriation several years after that. I don't recall the exact date, but they had 2 times where a supplemental filing was required.
And Bladeen, can you clarify the special action? Is that are you talking about a lawsuit?
Yes, Vice Chair, and if I don't give enough of an explanation, but the way I understand special action would be going to the Arizona Supreme Court, indicating that according to the Constitution, the Commission needs to be provided adequate funding. I think it would take the form of a writ of mandamus instructing the treasurer or someone to provide us the funds, and then asking the court to do something to achieve some form of a constitutional appropriation so that we could carry on our work. That's the best I understand it as a layman, but yes, it is a legal action.
Madam Chair, this is Linda.
Go ahead.
Mr. Bladeen, you said that you had arrived at the estimates that you've included in your suggested request based on what was required by the Commission 10 years ago, or what was used by the Commission at this time 10 years ago. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, Commissioner McNulty, yes. In essence, the only way I could project, or I could find to project what our cost may be to defend the map, was to look back at what happened 10 years ago in comparable months. However, as we all know, our months are not quite exactly comparable because they were in a different time frame. But it was the best thing I could find to try to come up with some comparability.
We really are, to talk about a budget here, I think is a misnomer in a way, because these are unknowns and unknowables that you're trying to plan for. So I applaud you for getting as close as you have to what we've needed. Have you, in putting this together, talked with legal counsel? It seems to me that a great deal of this anticipated expenditure is going to be legal fees. So I guess I would also ask the extent to which that is the case, and whether legal counsel has been able to give you any assistance in arriving at what may be an adequate, I don't think we want to lowball this, an adequate request for what we might anticipate. And I also wonder if we have estimated this based on what happened with the Commission 10 years ago, knowing that these are all one-offs and they're all completely different, and that things are 25% more expensive this year. Are we shooting ourselves in the foot by not factoring that 25% into our estimate? That's a lot of different questions, so let me break them down. have we gotten help from legal counsel in putting together this proposed request? What percentage of it is legal fees? And have we built in, or should we build in, a factor just for time, the time factor of money?
I'll start with the first one on the legal fees and then let Mary come in. As I've developed these, I have had discussions with both Mary and Joe, and reviewed figures with them. I would say, I think to a certain extent, they're in the same boat that I was. It's hard to know how much time you're going to put into various things. I think the last document that I provided you that has the $530,000 difference is generally something they thought was reasonable. But I will, if they want to come talk about that, I'll certainly defer to them. Let me jump to the second one. Yes, the vast majority of the cost last time and this time would be for legal and legal-related services such as experts and mapping. Last time, a lot of the money also, when you have to redraw the maps, go to the mapping consultant. So the real expenditure parts are mapping, the expert legal witnesses, and attorney fees. And on the last item of the 25%, I don't really know the answer to that. It makes sense that it should be more, but the fact that even with the extra fees that we've had at the front end, we're only a couple $100,000 off what happened last year, makes me think that we perhaps don't need to factor in. I do think the Commission has tried hard to keep its costs down. So I guess I would leave that up to the Commission to give me direction. And with that, I'll see if Mary wants to comment back on legal.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Commissioners, we have been conferring with Ray in trying to figure this out, knowing that we really don't know what's going to happen in terms of legal challenges or Department of Justice action on our submissions. But we did think, as Ray pointed out, that the best starting point was to look at the comparable timeframes for the last commission, since they did have to go to court. Since they did get an objection, they did get a request for information, they did have to go to court and establish interim lines. So they had, you know, a lot of the possibilities they had to go through last time. So we thought that was a reasonable starting point for the analysis, and so we have been trying to work with Ray. You make a good point. I don't know that we did build in a 25% increase in the numbers that have been requested, but we're on the same page in terms of how to approach the analysis generally. And it would be legal and mapping consultant, particularly if we have to draw new lines, or even responding to Department of Justice inquiries. A lot of times that is, those are technical questions that require the mapping consultant's assistance. And I don't know if Joe has any supplemental comments on that point.
No, thanks, Mary. I think that summarizes all of our conversations with Ray. We obviously don't know what legal issues are going to come up, if any, between now and the end of the fiscal year. So our advice has been to project based on what might come up and what's the worst case scenarios. And I think that's adequately set forth in Ray's proposal.
Madam Chair, I do have one more follow-up point, if I may. There is one thing we know is out there, which is the appeal on the open meeting case. We have moved for an extension of the time to file the answering brief, because the county attorney filed their answering brief on a very accelerated basis. Under the current schedule, our response would be due March 19th. So we've asked for that to be extended until 30 days after the Supreme Court issues its decision, thinking that would avoid the need for supplemental briefing. There also if we could, we'd push it further depending on the budget situation. That's obviously something that, unlike the election stuff that Ray's been talking about, from our perspective, that has to be done this fiscal year. The open meeting case does not seem as time sensitive in terms of this fiscal year. So we may try and push that off some more, but that's the only but if we can't, we have a brief due soon.
Madam Chair, it's Scott Freeman.
Go ahead.
Just a couple of questions. First, with respect to the open meeting law violation action, did the commission file a motion for an extension to respond?
We did file a motion for an extension of the time to respond.
Okay, and there's been no ruling on that by the court, correct?
That's right. Hasn't been ruled on yet.
Then another question is, looking back to the first part of 2002, that commission, I assume they got a request for information and an objection from the DOJ, so they were dealing with that. Then how many different lawsuits was that commission involved in, and in which forums during the first half of 2002, if anyone knows?
I think Christina is probably our best expert. She's saying 5 or 6 different lawsuits. I know she could provide you more information if you'd like that.
So there are about roughly 5 or 6 federal and state court? Okay, so both in federal and state court. And so those increased costs then are reflected in the numbers in that first half of 2002 on our spreadsheet then, correct?
Yes, I believe that's correct.
And sounds like what I'm getting is what you, Ray, and legal counsel sort of look to as maybe a first approximation in terms of estimating anticipated additional costs. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. As I mentioned before, it's really hard to compare the two directly. They had those kinds of costs in that time period. We had other legal costs. So going forward, the best thing I could come up with is what I did, but you're right.
Okay, but they had 5 or 6 different lawsuits, different forums. We did end up ending that fiscal year, it looked like spending a total of $3.3 million at the end of that fiscal year. And then I think it was, as I recall, in October of 2004, I believe, when they filed the special action because they were getting close to the $6 million, and I believe they were facing a trial in front of Judge Fields the following month. So that was going to be, they had already incurred, I believe, significant cost in getting prepared for that trial, but then there was going to be the additional cost, which would be significant in conducting that trial in November. If that's my recollection. If I'm incorrect, just let me know.
I believe, again, that's correct. That was the way, the sequence of events.
Madam Chair, this is Joe. The special action was filed on October 16th of 2003, and the trial that Commissioner Freeman refers to was scheduled to begin November 9th of 2003.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Bladine?
Madam Chair, this is Jose. I do have a question for Mr. Bladine.
Go ahead.
The audit, when will that take place, and how many have we been audited before by the state, or is this will be the first?
Madam Chair, Commissioner Herrera, I guess it depends how you want to use the word audit. I would see what is being requested in the Senate bill as being an audit by the Auditor General. No, we've not had an audit like that. However, to a certain extent, the information requested by Speaker Tobin that was provided, JLBC, laid out all of our expenditures and provided all the information that you would normally provide an auditor. So to an extent we have there. And then shortly after the chair was removed from office, the State Comptroller General went over all of the bills that were in the office of the state budget, or the state board's office. So those have also been kind of looked at. Again, from my perspective, I think there's no reason to object to an audit, but yes, I think that we have had our finances looked at already fairly closely.
No, and my intention for asking that was not to question whether we should, participate in the audit or not, because I think we should. But what I wanted is to get a comparison from what happened 10 years ago. Do you know if there was a review or an audit of the commission 10 years ago, and to what extent?
My understanding that there was not an audit 10 years ago of that commission's tenure life. I'm not aware that any was done, and I know that was Christina's understanding too.
Any other questions?
Madam Chair, I do have one question. I guess what this meeting's been very informative and it's great. But what action would you like the commission to take in order to speed up the process?
Madam Chairman, Commissioner Herrera, I think that after you've had the legal briefing of the council, my recommendation has been that we should receive authorization to file a special action, somehow with the understanding that if the appropriation comes through, we don't proceed. But I don't think, and I think Joe and Mary know this process better than I, but right now I can't see clearly that we're going to have the money in time that we need it, although there's certainly been some very positive movements at the legislature.
Madam Chair, it's Scott Freeman. I think I heard, go ahead. Mr. Blading, you estimated that the commission would likely run out of funds March 16th. Is that correct?
That's the best guess I have.
And is that based upon bills you believe are out there that will come due, or based on additional work, new work that the commission is going to undertake?
Mostly bills that are out there, but there's some room for some additional work, I think. Like I mentioned before, I think we have about $170,000 available right now in allotment. I have seen a bill from one of the legal firms and not the other. So I think that once I see that, I can give you a better idea. But best I can guess is that probably somewhere around the 16th, 17th, mid part of the month, we have really cut back on the things we know we can, ordering anything, any additional copies, and most likely, depending on the end of today's meeting, I would ask all the existing attorneys to hold off any additional work until we know we have a supplemental appropriation. I guess really what I'm hoping is that maybe we have $50,000 or $60,000 that we have some discretion over. That would be my hope, that we could use to fund whatever legal action we need to do now to protect our finances.
Madam Chair,
Yes, ma'am.
Question. Have you received February invoices from the law firm, from our own legal counsel, and then anybody that was working on the open meeting law?
No, I have not received February. I believe I've received January. I've got to go back and look. One came in just the other day, but I believe it was for January.
Yeah, because I would think our legal expenses from February are probably just pretty high, given the amount of work that had to get done to get these two submissions into the Justice Department. So,
Madam Chair, that's what I would anticipate too, but I've been surprised a lot. So, but I would anticipate that would be true.
and Madam Chairman, it might be appropriate for, I guess, Joe, if you want to address the special action. I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the timing issues. We have asked for expedited review at Department of Justice. You never know how that goes, but in terms of the congressional, their 60 days is up April 10th. And so by that date, we'll have to know something. We'll have to know whether it's pre-cleared, we'll have to know whether we have a request for additional information or an objection. And so 2 out of 3 possibilities there, would require some commission action. That could come earlier. We have asked for expedited review, and so that could come earlier. And then our legislative is due at the end of next month. So anyway, there's not much of a window period here that we have. And then we also, in terms of before additional action might be necessary. And we never know when they might, call us and say we need this and we need that. And in terms of the overall timing, one of our goals is to be just as responsive as we can, so that if they need something, we get it to them right away, so it doesn't hold up the overall review of the pre-clearance submissions. I mean, that's been our hope. So I have that in terms of timing, and I don't know, if it be helpful, maybe Joe, would it help for Joe to address the special action issues and some of those timing issues? Or I'd be happy to.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I just waiting for direction from the chair.
Oh, sorry, Joe. Go ahead, Joe. I thought she was.
Okay. Well, and Madam Chair, I'm assuming we're on the next agenda item.
Possible executive session for the purpose of discussion or consultation for legal advice with the Commission's attorneys.
Yes, and I'm just pulling up yeah, I mean, I think we need to move on to that item so we can give you advice at this point as we talk about the special action. Whether you want to do an executive session or not, we don't have concerns either way.
Madam Chair, this is Jose. Is there anything we can cover before, if we can, get as much done before we go into executive session, if that's what we decide?
I'm happy to not have executive session on this if the attorneys are comfortable going forward. So what does the commission want to do? I don't know what they're going to tell us, or so it's hard for me to judge whether we need to be in executive session or not.
Madam Chair, I think we can talk about the outlines. We have, as a matter of public record, the lawsuit that the last commission filed when they, and so we can talk about those legal theories and some of the timing needs. So, want us to go ahead and do that? And we can do that in public session because that is a public record in terms of the theories that were used last time.
Yes, I would say yes. I would prefer that you give us as much information as you can in public session.
Madam Chair?
Mr. Canfield?
This is Rick Sturts.
Sorry, Mr. Sturts.
Just a couple of quick questions, just so that I can get my some practical sense to this. The House has a bill in front of itself, House Bill 26 or 2862, that utilizes the number of $1,130,000, which is the number that Mr. Blake Dean provided to work its way through the legislature. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And the Senate has a bill on the floor as well that's been dropped that has a blank in it that is waiting for some discussion to figure out what that number wants to be. Is that also correct?
That's also the way I understand it.
Okay. And so the process of asking for the supplemental appropriation is already underway with the legislature. I'm trying to ascertain any reason at all while this is working its way through the practical and timely. The legislature understands that there is going to be a need to continue to move the election process forward. They understand that there is going to be a need for additional funding. Well, I'm trying to get my head around why we're going to be going into discussion about why we want to sue the legislature.
Madam Chair, perhaps since I was the one that asked for the meeting, when we asked for the meeting, none of this had happened. It was subsequent to us asking for this meeting that this activity started. And while I'm very, and I, you know, I'm very pleased that it has, and I'm sure you are, I guess the question is, you know, well, where will it go? And that clearly is all of your decision as to how you want to proceed from here.
Madam Chair, this is Joe. Maybe if I walk through the special action from 2003, it might help inform some of the timing questions raised by Commissioner Sturts and for other commissioners are curious about.
Go ahead.
In 2003, as Ray mentioned earlier, the Commission did authorize council to file a special action in the Arizona Supreme Court in the nature of mandamus. The defendants, respondents in that suit was not the legislature, but the state treasurer and the director of the Department of Administration, and also the named was the judge in the Superior Court proceedings, not so much related to funding as it was related to requesting a stay of the legal proceedings, which was denied by the Superior Court judge until the funding issue was resolved. So we don't necessarily have that same issue this round. In that case, the legal theory was one of what we call constitutional appropriation, whereby an appropriation is made within the Constitution itself, and not as a result of a legislative decision. And the theory being that, and there's case law that supports this that's outlined in the petition filed by the Commission in 2003, but that if the legislature refuses to fund the Commission has a legal and constitutional right to have resources necessary to perform its essential duties, and therefore it can seek an appropriation, a constitutional appropriation, which would effectively be blessed by the court through a mandamus proceeding, whereby the treasurer and the Department of Administration would be ordered to provide the Commission whatever funding that it determines is necessary and is accepted as necessary funding by the court. So that's, and the reason, the only concern about timing is I think it is appropriate for the Commission to be working with the legislature here. The Constitution, Prop 106, certainly envisions that there is a role for the legislature to play here. It doesn't address what happens if the legislature refuses to fund. So that's where the legal issue could arise if the legislature doesn't provide the Commission a supplemental appropriation, or if the appropriation provided is deemed by the Commission to be insufficient to carry on its duties. So we would, and because of the timing here, it's already, I can't remember the date, March 2nd or 3rd today, March 2nd, that Mary and I would need some time, obviously, to put together a petition of this sort. We would not advise filing it while the legislature is working while the legislative process is working its way through. But at some point, we would need to likely file that suit if the decision that the legislature has made to not provide a supplemental appropriation. And we're fortunate that the legislature has indeed dropped these bills and provided at least one hearing, but that's a long way away from actually, I think, both houses and obtaining the signature of the governor. So given the timing over the next 2 weeks, according to Ray's predictions, we're in a little bit of a bind, because as you will see if you read the legal analysis set forth by our predecessor counsel, the Commission, there's certainly an argument that if, in the absence of a constitutional appropriation or legislative appropriation, the incurring an expenditure obligation without an appropriation creates some legal issues under some statutes in Title 35. There's legal issues associated with just the extent they apply, and given that the constitutional language that provides the commission an appropriation, but rather than leaving that to chance, it would be better to have those issues vetted by the court in an expedited manner, and we would ask for you to provide us the discretion to determine the best timing to do that in light of the development of the legislature.
Mr. Canfield, this is Colleen. I had thought that was kind of the primary reason for us meeting today, is because of the letter from Mr. Arnold in February, where he referred us to ARS 35-211, and essentially we can't be incurring expenditures. We don't have an allocation to do so. And if Ray thinks we're going to be out of money in 2 weeks, I don't know how we proceed. So it seems prudent that we should be at least ready to file the special action.
Madam Chair, I agree with that. Is there, Madam Chair, legal counsel, are there nuances to this that you would advise we should discuss in executive session? Or have you given us the outline?
Madam Chair, Commissioner McNulty, I think we've given you a pretty good overview of what the issues are. We have the benefit of having your predecessors already vet this issue. I'm not sure there's any other advice that we would necessarily need to provide you in executive session at this point, so my recommendation would be that's not necessary, but Mary may have some thoughts on that.
Madam Chair, I agree with Joe.
You said you agree, Mary?
Yes, Madam Chair, I agree with Joe that we don't need an executive session on this unless the members feel otherwise.
Madam Chair, fellow commissioners, I think it's important that we have an obligation, a constitutional obligation to do this job. I think we have been trying to do it the best we can. I think Ray has done the best he can to anticipate what we might need in consultation with our legal team. And so I think we should give our legal team, Ray and our legal team, authorization to proceed with a special action and to determine whether and when it's necessary to proceed with that in light of the ongoing efforts on behalf of legislators to fund us. And I would make that motion if that's appropriate.
Madam Chair, I'll second that motion.
Okay, any discussion?
Madam Chair, it's Scott Freeman. This will be a question for legal counsel. Counsel, does the recent decision from Division 2 of the Court of Appeals, the Fogliano decision, undercut the notion that this commission is somehow entitled to a constitutional appropriation, whereby we would ask the court effectively to substitute its judgment for what an appropriate amount of appropriation is for that of the legislature?
Joe, since that was a case you're familiar with, I'll let you, maybe you should respond to that one.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Freeman, that was my case. I represented Access in that case, and it was recently finalized. The Supreme Court denied review a few weeks ago. The issue in that case was whether the legislature had the discretion under a statute to decide whether there was sufficient funding to provide funding for a childless adult Medicaid population. The legislature determined it did not have enough money, and the lawsuit was brought arguing that the legislature did not have the discretion and had to fund. So one of the main issues in that case we briefed and argued was the political question doctrine, And we did reference some of the case law that was referenced in the special action from 10 years ago, or 2003. I think there's some key differences between the two. The main difference being that the commission is established and created in the Constitution. Its provisions are self-executing, and there is a constitutional there's constitutional language that establishes the commission's right to receive sufficient resources to do its job. So that's the main issue that differentiates the two. Now, the challengers in Fagliano were arguing that the law had the force and effect of a constitutional provision because it was protected by Proposition 105, the Voter Protection Act, established in the Constitution. But the court essentially rejected that theory, and provided legislature did have an obligation to fund, but had the discretion to decide whether or not to fund, and the decision was not going to be second guessed by the court under the political question doctrine. That doctrine, it gets a little bit trickier to argue when you're talking about the Constitution itself, and that was again one of the main points that we distinguished when we argued the case in Fagliano between the doctrine, the constitutional appropriation doctrine, and what we had in Fagliano. So I know it's a long answer to your question, and obviously, we can't control what legal arguments would be made by those opposed to us, but I think that the issue here will be grounded in the language in paragraphs 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 of Proposition 106, and what that means, and whether that in fact establishes a constitutional appropriation that must be funded, and if the legislature, although it does have a role envisioned by the drafters of Prop 106, it raises a constitutional question if the legislature provides no resources to the commission or insufficient resources. That's obviously something that we'll have to wrestle with if that's the case.
Madam Chair?
Go ahead, Mr. Stewart.
My question is this. We were just informed by the executive director that we do not have current funding. And unless the attorneys are going to be doing this legal work pro bono, we would be then entering into an obligation for additional costs, of which we've just been informed that we do not have the funding to support.
Well, Madam Chair, I think that's the reason that Mr. Bladine has asked us to move ahead with all due haste, and I think that's what we need to do.
Again, Madam Chair, this is where I can't support this motion because we are asking us to enter into an obligation of which we've just been informed that we can't pay for. Simultaneously, the legislation is going through the process of getting the appropriate funds pulled together that have been requested by the commission. So I will not be supporting this motion.
Madam Chair,
Go ahead, Mr. Cahill.
Commissioners, maybe I can just help by directing you to what the position taken by the commission in the 2003 special action. In that briefing, the commission had directed its attorneys not to perform other services, including appearing and defending the commission at the trial that following November, unless funds became available. But it did authorize the filing of the special action with the understanding that its attorney's fees or expenses would be paid by the Treasurer and the Department of Administration only if the commission prevailed, and never by IRC funds. And I'm reading that right from the special action itself on page 13.
And another point, in terms of the timing, obviously we're hoping that we don't have to have more litigation from a legal perspective. We would rather not be having to take those steps, and so but because of the time when we have to be ready to take those steps, that's sort of the box we're in here. But because of the hearings that are set and what we're hearing in terms of the legislative response thus far, I mean, we certainly wouldn't advise filing until it's clear that that's not going to happen in the time frame that we need. In terms of the timing, the legislature can move, quickly. It has the ability procedurally to do so, and having a bill in the House and the Senate can help facilitate that. But those bills have to, be identical at some point in the process for that to move things along. So but I think if we get past the end of next week, I can't see it slipping into the following week without needing to go to court. But hopefully with hearings Tuesday and Wednesday, we'll get some action and get an appropriation in place and wouldn't need more litigation.
Madam Chair, it's Scott Freeman.
Go ahead.
First, just Commissioner Sturts, while you were speaking, Commissioner Herrera said, "Surprise, surprise." I just wanted to make sure that little comment made its way into the record. But I have a question. The question concerns, I understand that when Prop 106 was passed, it had an allocation, the people voted for an allocation of $6 million for the first commission. But subsequent commissions, there was no set appropriation made. When this commission began, I believe, we had an appropriation of $500,000 to get us through the end of that first fiscal year. How did that appropriation come about? I mean, it wasn't this commission asking for it, obviously, if anyone knows.
Madam Chairman, Vice Chair Freeman, my understanding is that the Department of Administration had made the request for the $500,000 in 11 and the $3 million in 5. I do recall that I had seen at one time where they had asked for more like the $7 million, or more like $7 million, but then when it went through the process, it came back to 3.5. So that was, I think, the legislator back in probably 10 and DOA doing their best job to, okay, what's reasonable to appropriate.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Freeman, that is the process that is set up in the Constitution. The initial commission got a $6 million appropriation in the Constitution itself, and then every redistricting thereafter, there's a process set forth in paragraph 18 of the commission that has the Department of Administration submitting to the legislature a recommendation for an appropriation for adequate redistricting expenses, and then they also are obligated to make available office space for the commission to do its work. And then the following census, the legislature shall make the necessary appropriations by a majority vote.
Right, and I agree, and I guess it wasn't the last commission that went to the Department of Administration or to the legislature to have input. It was the DOA working with the legislature on those initial two appropriations. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, Vice Mayor.
Yes, that's correct.
Madam Chair, this is Commissioner Herrera. There was a motion made and seconded, so I'd like to call the question so we can move forward with the vote.
Just one more thing, Madam Chair, Commissioner Freeman. I also recall when we learned of those initial appropriations that there was at least one commissioner commenting about how generous they were and how we should find a legislator and hug them or thank them for being so generous to us.
Is there any other discussion on that motion that's at hand? So as I have it, this motion is that Ms. McNulty made and Mr. Herrera seconded was to give Ray and the legal team, or I should say Mr. Bladine and the legal team, the authority to proceed with the special action. Is that accurate, or do we need to add anything to that?
And to determine whether and when to file it in light of the proceedings in the legislature. To determine in their own discretion without further direction from us whether and when to file it.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
McNulty, aye.
Aye, Jose.
Okay, it sounds like I'm only hearing one aye. I would vote aye on that as well. Mathis?
Madam Chair,
Opposed?
this is Jose. There's actually
Church, nay.
there's 3 ayes.
Freeman, nay.
Okay, one nay, and that's Mr. Sturts, and then
Madam Chair, there's 2 nays. Commissioner Freeman voted nay. I voted aye.
well, I'm not sure where Mr. Herrera and Mr. Freeman are on this vote.
Madam Chair, you weren't hearing us there for a while. Commissioner Herrera voted in favor of the motion, and I voted against the motion. So it's 3-2.
Okay, I guess I couldn't hear the Evans House for some reason. So, to get the vote straight, it sounds like Mr. Herrera is voting aye on that, and Mr. Freeman is voting no.
Yes.
And Madam Chair?
Mr. Sturts?
Unfortunately, I've got to step out of this meeting now, and I want to thank you for your being able to be so expeditious in getting us to the vote before 3 o'clock. I've had some personal issues this week that I've got to continue to take care of today.
Okay. Thanks for
So
your
I'm
time.
dropping off the call.
Okay.
Madam Chair, are you still there? Oh, my. Yoo-hoo!
I'm still on the phone, so there's still the connection. I think we may have lost the chair.
I'm still on the phone. Do you want me to be, or do you want me not to be?
No, we would have a quorum with you, Commissioner McNulty said, oh, don't hang up.
I guess the legal counsel would need to advise, but if the chair isn't available, and I think the only thing left to do is to adjourn, one of the vice chairs would handle the meeting.
Before we do that, I just have an issue that I want to bring up that Commissioner McNulty had brought up, and that's the money that we're asking in this to hold us through. That I want to make sure that it is sufficient. I mean, I know we're using the numbers based on the commission 10 years ago, but I want to make sure that we are really putting our heads together and coming up with the accurate amount as much as we can, so we won't have to be doing this again. So, I mean, I know you guys are doing your best to make sure that you think of all the things that might come up, cutting costs when you need, where you have to, but I want to make sure that we're asking for the correct amount.
Madam Chair, are you back online?
I am. I don't know what happened when Mr. Sturts cut off my line as well.
That's kind of what we figured out. Did you hear Mr. Vice Chair Herrera's question?
No,
Basically, the question was, how confident are we that we've asked for the right amount and that we won't have to be back here doing this? And I guess the best I can say is I'm as confident as I can be. I think it's reasonable what we've asked for. I understand the issue of 25% over 10 years, but given how well we've done so far, I think that if we get the 1.1 million and the ability to have that carry over to 2013, I think that's the best estimate I can give you what we need not to come back, barring any huge litigation of 4 or 5 suits like the last commission had.
Thanks. Is there anything else we need to talk about? Another agenda item is discussion of possible action related to the commission finances. So, anything else? Any questions or comments?
Madam Chair, this is Commissioner Herrera. I do have a question for Mr. Bladine.
I couldn't hear that.
This is Commissioner Jose. Can I ask a question of Mr. Bladine? Ms. Shortening.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
See, it worked.
Somebody's rushed a lot of papers right by a speaker, so somebody could stop doing that.
Not me. Mr. Bladine, I know you had talked about reducing our budget, where we can, and I want to see if you can compare the amount of, the expenditures compared to an apple-to-apples comparison to what the commission did 10 years ago. 'Cause it looks like you've cut a lot out, and I want to see what the commission did 10 years ago. If you remember, were they doing the same thing? Is that where you got the idea, or were they not cutting back? I'd like to get some information if you have it.
Madam Chair, Vice Chair, we can, it quickly comes to mind, we can provide you what the by year, what the last commission spent. All I can tell you is we pretty much, when we developed our budget and came back to you, we kind of looked at what they did last year, but we really, both Christina and I, tried to figure out, okay, how's the best way to staff this? So we did take a different staffing pattern. Our community outreach people both have served as outreach and have served for data input and for office services. So it is a bit of a difference to compare, but we'll pull together some information.
And the reason I ask, and it's probably pretty apparent, that I want to give the legislators and the public a true picture of what this commission has gone through, and that we've gone out of our way to cut expenses where we can. So I want to make sure that people see that and they see the actual numbers. Thank you.
Okay, any other comments? Questions? Okay, well, we're at the end of the agenda. Is Kristen Winford there?
No, she's not here today at the meeting.
I just wanted to wish her well if she was, but we will go ahead and adjourn this meeting. Thanks everyone for being on the call. The time is 3:16 p.m. and this meeting's adjourned.